The term psychological thriller is constantly being brought up in this day and age when describing certain horror movies, and I wanted to talk about if it was a justifiable term to use when talking about certain movies, so let's talk about it. It's very obvious that horror movies as well as comedy movies are some of the least respected genres in film. Rarely do they ever get nominated for prestigious award shows like the Oscars or the Golden Globes or even BAFTAs. Usually they are designated to award shows that were designed specifically for their genres, like the Saturn Awards for horror, mainly sci-fi, but still, or the American Comedy Awards for comedy, although that has since been defunct for over 20 years. However, I've come to notice in the coming years that people have been fighting back against this ongoing hatred of horror films, as they can be as great or as prestigious as your dramas or period pieces that the Oscars love to jerk off time and time again. A great example was when Mia Goth stated that she felt it was unfair that her performance in Pearl was not even considered due to it being a horror film, despite having a ton of merit and certainly being more memorable than Andrea Riseborough's in To Leslie, which I heard was a mediocre performance at best. But we aren't here to talk about the unfair treatment of horror films. What we are talking about is when they are treated fairly in those very few instances, but still not totally. I already talked about the term elevated horror on my live show last year, and if you want to know more, the link will be in the description. I first noticed this in two very big instances, when Get Out was nominated and when Silence of the Lambs' sweeping of the Oscars is ever talked about. Get Out is a film I appreciated more and more as time went on. Mainly as the overhype diminished, my appreciation for it grew. When it got nominated, I thought it was well-deserved, and I was happy that a horror film got nominated. But that is when the trouble began. Well, not necessarily began, but my notice of it. People were not calling it a horror film. Even horror fans were calling it quote-unquote elevated horror, which was certainly eye-rolling. But all the Hollywood snobs were calling it a psychological thriller. Not a horror film, or even a psychological horror film, but a psychological thriller. I felt that was very irksome, because it's so clearly a fucking horror film. And then from then on out, I noticed a trend. Whenever a horror film got tons and tons of praise, it was called either elevated horror and or a psychological thriller. Movies like The Night House, Relic, The Invisible Man, Last Night in Soho, The Candyman requel, Possessor, A Quiet Place, and so on and so forth. All movies that were beloved by the main populace that were undoubtedly horror movies were being called psychological thrillers. It doesn't help that Scream 5 also added to this bullshit with making the term elevated horror even more popular. One of the many things wrong with that movie, but let's not get into that. Silence of the Lambs is simply not considered a horror film despite the fact it's about a guy kidnapping women, making them skinny, killing them, and skinning off their flesh to make a flesh suit, whilst also featuring a guy that fucking eats people. What kind of levels of absolute fucking stupidity do you have to be to not consider that a fucking horror film? Oh, but it's not about him doing that, it's about Clarice trying to...
Shut up! Oh my god, I don't care!
With all of this, is the term psychological thriller now a bad word, or phrase, or whatever? At least the term elevated horror was always fucking stupid. Psychological thriller is a proper term for some movies, even great ones. The Machinist, The Game, Taxi Driver, Duel, and plenty of others. They fit into the idea of messing with you psychologically, but not necessarily going into horror levels. Even The Machinist somewhat bleeds into horror at certain points. Obviously, this will never change when it comes to the snobs who are embarrassed to like horror movies and use terms such as these, but when it comes to everybody else, try to be more aware when trying to differentiate the two. Hell, even use the term psychological horror, as I mentioned before, because that is the best of both worlds. The main idea of using these terms comes from the embarrassment of liking a genre when not to be. Obviously, I don't have to tell horror fans this, but even they make that mistake. Hell, I've made that mistake, and you'll see that when I talk about my top 10 favorite movies of all time. I don't want to say psychological thriller is a bad term, because it isn't. It's perfectly fine to use, but when it becomes synonymous when just talking about horror movies from snobby people who look down upon the genre, it almost becomes a bad term. Well, maybe not bad, but overused and incorrect when it comes to a lot of movies. It's a good description / subgenre. Just remember to take a step back and use it properly. Don't be ashamed of what you like. But that is it for post Monster Madness. I really didn't have a ton of ideas to do this year, but I still wanted to give you guys a couple, and luckily with fixing Halloween 3000, it'll be, a constant thing for a period of time, so that'll kind of, extend into it, I guess. Stay tuned for the next video in My Favorite Films, the third part in DCCU and MEU What If video, and Doctor Who The Cancelled Chronicles. But with that, see you next week with another video.